time away from the substance.
If you want to take your mask off, but Mike,
Don't want to take time away from the substance.
got it.
And I believe that the presentation itself will do more than attest to Abbas's knowledge of this subject. So thank you, my friend. And it's all yours.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everybody. Thank you all for coming, whether digitally or in flesh. It is for me a pleasure, a daunting pleasure, I have to say, to be back in this room. It is a pleasure because it is in this room that I think I found what, in my view, is the most promising aspect of America. Civil society in America, the great bulwark against fascism, against authoritarianism, against failure of democracy. It is these kinds of meetings that are what makes America, I think, the bastion of democracy that it has always been. Actually, de Tocqueville, who's probably written one of the most remarkable books about American democracy, says it is the American churches that are the most singular aspect of democracy. They're devoted, but they're also dedicated to secularism. And they combine piety with secularism in ways no other country, I think, has done. So in that sense, for me, it's a great pleasure to be here. It's daunting because we're supposed to talk about great decisions. And I always feel like talking about great decisions in front of my dear friend is like talking about great decisions in front of people who make those decisions. So we study them, he makes them. So whatever you want to know about what great decisions are, ask him, and he will correct whatever I have said. Now, I'm going to talk about Iran, but I'm going to basically say that Iran is connected to maybe the most important decision facing the world today. Iran is, I think, centrally connected, in some ways, maybe pivotally connected to what I think is now the challenge of our time. In one sense, the challenge is the rise of artificial intelligence and the digital age. If you haven't read the book by Kissinger and Eric Schmidt, and a professor at MIT, called The Age of AI and Our Human Future. Basically what he's saying, and I think is absolutely right, they are absolutely right, is that we are at a pivotal moment in history, the likes of which has been experienced only once. This moment is comparable, they say, and I fully agree with them, with the moment of Renaissance, where almost everything about human society, about knowledge, about how we disseminate knowledge, who we think can get knowledge, changed. The printing press came, the rise of nation states came, the rise of democracy came, humanism came, and the belief that human reason is the solution to human problems. Now they say human reason might soon be playing second fiddle to artificial intelligence. Issues that human reason cannot possibly solve, artificial intelligence is solving. And artificial intelligence and the social media and all of the technologies available, some of it constructed right here, is at the service of authoritarianism, not just at the service of democracy, but the service of authoritarianism. So it's a pivotal moment where the democracy, in a sense, I think historically, will survive. These technologies can be tools for human redemption and equality and education. They can also be tools of enslavement, creating a society that will make Orwell look like Sunday school preacher. The abilities of China, a country like China, and the ability of Iran, for example, to tap into what China can do in order to control society is truly frightening. The only point of hope is that maybe the wisdom of people and the goodwill of people will overpower or will trump the desires of the authoritarians to use this technology for their own purpose. Now, this pivotal moment, in my view, has become concurrent, what makes it particularly a perilous moment, with the rise of a new form of authoritarianism. Many people talk about the rise of a new Cold War. I think this is slightly more dangerous than the Cold War, because in this new authoritarianism, you have China that can make a claim and is making the claim that it is a better alternative for the future of humankind than democracy. That their form of authoritarianism has done more for the Chinese, and they claim for the Africans, for everywhere else, than liberal democracy has done. We, they say, have raised 700 million people from poverty to middle class. What have you recently done? They're making this argument, and they're making it in Iran, and they're making it much of the rest of the world. So the rise of this authoritarianism, spearheaded by China, with a remarkable ideological apparatus that helps it, with a remarkable soft and sharp power in America and in Europe that defends it, that articulates it, that fights its critics, that blacklists the academicians who dare criticize it, help with Russia, help with an aspiring Iran, Hungary, makes this rise in authoritarianism, I think, a very, very serious pivotal moment. They are trying to change the discourse. 20 years ago, China, at least ostensibly, articulated that they believed in some form of democracy, some form of a market economy. They claimed that they want to integrate into the international global system. Now, they're defiant, they're saying, we don't want that, and nobody else should want it. And it is in this moment that Iran is experiencing one of its most important, I think, moments of crisis. I'm going to talk about Iran, and Iran is very much consciously, and in the last few years, unabashedly trying to pivot away from the West towards this Asian model that they tout. This regime came to power with the promise, a slogan, neither East nor West. That was one of the clarion calls of Khomeini in 1979. And by the West, they meant essentially America, to a lesser extent Europe, the great Satan, as Khomeini called it. And by the East, they meant essentially the Soviet Union, and to a lesser extent China. China wasn't at the time the global presence. Khomeini literally banned China from coming to Iran for 2.5 years after 79, because China was the last country in the world to still believe that the Shah might last. The last head of a state to visit Iran was Hua Kofeng. And that was maybe a month and a half before the Shah fell. And that angered Khomeini, and he literally banned them. And it took him 2.5, 3 years before they came in. Now, they unabashedly, openly say, we want to join the Chinese sanctuary. They are openly talking about creating a new currency to replace the dollar for all their barter and all their oil exchanges. Not just the Chinese currency that is being actively promoted, but a new kind of a currency. So Iran is trying to make this pivot. What has happened, interestingly, is that at this moment where Iran is making this pivot, Iran has had one of the most remarkable movements in its history, led by women, for woman equality, for the right of women to decide what they want to wear, how they can appear in public, what kind of programs at universities they can follow. And it has created a movement under the, I think, stunningly clever slogan, woman, life, and liberty. It is a national Me Too movement. It is unheard of in Iran. And I have talked to my colleagues at Stanford. I've talked to Larry Diamond, one of the most world-renowned experts on democracy and democratic movements. I've talked to Mike McFall. Whether there is any movement that is similar to the movement in Iran since last October. From last October, women essentially took to the streets and said, enough is enough. Now, when Khomeini came to power, one of his slogans was neither East nor West. The other slogan, the other promise, very clearly made, was that Iran is going to be a republic. The women are not going to be forced to wear the veil. He lied. When he was asked why he made that promise, and he changed later, he said, I lied. He said, I engaged in what in Shia theology is called taqiyya. Taqiyya literally means salutary lie. Shiism says Shiite faith is based on taqiyya. Its survival is based on taqiyya. In other words, not just the ability, but the responsibility to lie to the enemy in order to promote the faith and the faithful. And Khomeini literally said, I engaged in taqiyya. Taqiyya is very close to what in Christian theology we call Jesuitical dissimulation, Jesuitical lie. And from Shakespeare's time, it was accepted in Shakespeare's time that part of the problem with Jesuits is that they believe they can lie to promote their faith. So they can't become citizens of a democracy, because in a democracy, when you take the oath to tell the truth. Literally, Catholic and Protestant theologians said, these people can't be citizens of a democracy because they say we lie, and we lie to promote our faith. Khomeini literally said, I lie to people. I lie to people on women's veil. Now they have to wear the veil. And from then on, we had this movement, almost incessant movement, for women to have the freedom to wear their clothes, for women to begin to take back some of the rights that Khomeini took away from them literally the first week he took power. Under the Shah, some of you might remember the Shah's period. I have to tell you, by way of disclosure, I was an opponent of the Shah. I spent a year in prison under the Shah. I was a leftist. But the Shah, and I've written a book about him, it's called The Shah, where I try to explain why he made the changes he made. He made remarkable changes, and why he fell. The changes, I think, put Iran on the path to become a country maybe comparable to South Korea. The Iranian economy in 1975 was competitive and comparable to South Korea, to Taiwan, to Turkey as a sort of some country that was following. Look at where they are and look at where Iran is, the Iranian economy. One of the changes made during that period one of the very important changes made during that period was increased rights for women. If you have heard, if you have listened to almost any historian of modern Iran, they would say that the women's movement was forced on Iranian women by Reza Shah, the father of the last Shah, who forcefully unveiled Iranian women. There is a remarkable new scholarship that shows this is nonsense. Iranian women were fighting for their rights long before Reza Shah was Reza Shah. The first woman to take off her veil and deliver a sermon, actually, it was in a religious context, in the rise of a new religion called Bab, which is now Baha'ism. You've heard of the Baha'is. This woman is a precursor of the Baha'is. Her name is Qurratul Ain. 2 years before Seneca falls in this country, which is credited to be the beginning of the women's movement, she appeared in a gathering of religious co-religionists, took off her veil, and delivered the sermon. That's how old the question of veil is in Iran. This is 100, almost 80 years before Reza Shah. So women were fighting for these rights. They got the right to vote in 1963. They the right to be elected. We had members of the parliament. We had judges. We had ministers. We even had a minister for women affairs. I think the second in the world and the first in the Muslim country. Women began to have the right to file for divorce. According to Islamic law, a woman can only under rarest of circumstances file for divorce. A man can divorce his wife at will, literally at will. He goes to doesn't even have to go to the court. Go to the notary and say, I divorce her. And she gets virtually nothing, virtually never gets custody. There is no community property. There is no alimony. The woman gets essentially what she has gathered. That's why a lot of women bought a lot of jewelry. That's why a lot of women put something called bridal money. That's a very collectible debt. Upon divorce, the only thing the man has to pay is what they have agreed to in that prenuptial agreement. Women were beginning to get the right to file for divorce. Women were beginning to get the right to apply for a passport. In Iran today, you cannot apply for a passport if you're a woman unless you have the approval of your manfolk. You can't get a surgery unless your manfolk allows. These rights were being given to women in the 1970s. That was the first law Khomeini changed. The first law from the Shah's period that they changed was the family law. The first thing they said is men can now have as many wives as they want, essentially. Polygamy, made virtually illegal under the Shah, was now made legal. They made something else legal that was, again, virtually declared illegal under the Shah. Shiites have a practice that's called mut'eh, or sigeh. It's a temporary marriage. All it takes is for a man to tell a woman that I marry you for an hour for such and such reward. In Iran today, you can go to the holiest cities, Mashhad, and rent a room with a woman or without a woman under this religious rubric, under this temporary marriage. Men can have as many temporary marriages as they want. Women can have only one at a time. And after each, they need to wait for 90 days and they can go to the next. And the 90 days is so that if she's pregnant, they can decide who the father is. Incidentally, if she's pregnant, the child is fully legal. So for men, chauvinist men, misogynist men, the Islamic Republic has been a heaven. You can literally do with your wife what you want. She has not only no right, but even under existing laws, they haven't yet been able to pass a law that clearly says men cannot beat their women, their wives. Because there is a verse in the Quran, the holiest of holy books in Islam, that says, when you beat your wives, beat them softly so that there is no signs left. Now, for men, all of these things, for misogynist men, for men who want to dominate women, for men who want to have many sigars, this might be heaven. For women, it's a living hell. And women have been fighting for it. And they have been fighting in what I think is one of the most remarkable civil disobedience movements in recent memory. I think it's comparable to the civil disobedience movement in this country led by Martin Luther King. Women kept fighting inch by inch, pushing their headscarves back. The West didn't pay much attention. The Islamic Republic fought, but the regime continued till October, when there was a remarkable movement. When women decided to take the scarves off, sometimes they start bonfires and burned it. The regime was caught initially off guard, but then they went on a rampage. They have minimally killed 500 people in streets, arrested several tens of thousands of people. They themselves recently announced that they have pardoned upward of 20,000 of the recent arrestees. So they absolutely tried to contain it, but it hasn't worked yet. In the last few weeks, they decided that they're going to do it in the Chinese way. They have bought sophisticated facial recognition cameras and put it on every street and announced that anyone who appears in public, any woman who appears in public without the hijab, we're going to take a picture. First, we're going to fine you. Second, we're going to increase the fine. Third, we're going to stop your bank account. We're going to stop your passport. So a massive Orwellian control that was to be begun 2 days ago. Over the last 2-3 days, women have shown that they're still not backing down. So the regime is facing a very serious social problem. Its biggest problem, big as the problem with women is the economy. The Iranian economy is on the verge of complete collapse. To give you an example, in 1979, if you had $1, you could get 7 Persian tumam. Or conversely, if you have 7 tumam in 1979, you get $1. Today, it was increased from yesterday. Yesterday was 50,000. Today is 51,000. You need 51,000 tumam to get $1. And the actual price is probably higher. The central bank claims that they poured in $20 billion in the market, in the streets, to control the price. It's not controllable. The economy is on the verge of collapse. I think Iran might well be the only country in the world that has had 44 out of 44 years of the Islamic Republic. On 42 of them, there has been double inflation, double digit, and double digit unemployment. In other words, the economy is heating up double digitally, and the economy is collapsing double digitally. The economists call this stagflation. When it first appeared, it drove the economists berserk. Iran has been facing with that. And there's no remedy in sight. They tried to get the Chinese to help them solve the problem. So they offered the Chinese a 25-year deal about 2 years ago. They offered virtually the same deal to Russia. But Russia is a basket case economy. It can't hardly afford to pour in billions of dollars into Iran. China does have the money. Iran gave it a deal that I think I've never seen in the modern history of Iran since I've studied it. A deal that was so one-sided in offering the Chinese virtually anything they want. The right of first refusal on virtually all the big contracts. Oil and gas at stabilized prices. A port in the Persian Gulf. Maybe a rental of one of the islands in the Persian Gulf. The ability to have military in Iran. The Chinese said, thank you, that's a wonderful deal. Yes, we will do it. They were supposed to pour in $400 billion over the 25-year. As far as I know, they haven't poured in $4 billion, not $400 billion. They took the deal and went across the Persian Gulf to Saudi Arabia, Iran's big foe. A few months ago, the president of China went to Saudi Arabia. They signed deals that is estimated to be valued between Qatar, United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, $400 billion. It guarantees them energy, and it guarantees them access to maybe $1 trillion more in sovereign funds that Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates and Qatar have. With that deal in their pocket, they came back and tried to reward Iran politically rather than economically. They haven't helped Iran economically because I don't think they think Iran can last. They didn't take the Iranian offer to have Chah Bahar. They spent instead $45 billion and build a port in Pakistan that gives them access to the Indian Ocean and very close to the Persian Gulf. Now they're trying to force an alliance between Saudi Arabia and Iran under the leadership of China, Saudi Arabia, and Iran, who were at each other's throats for many years, fighting a proxy war in Yemen, fighting a proxy war in Syria, fighting a proxy war in Lebanon, fighting a proxy war more discreetly in Iraq, are now suddenly invited by China to an agreement. The agreement is not going to save the Iranian regime, but the agreement does give them a political lifeline. It brought them out of the isolation that they had come to as a result of the rising tide of women's movement. When the movement continued from October to almost January at full rate, and then it began to diminish, Europeans completely stopped negotiation on the nuclear deal. Iran was desperate to revive the nuclear deal that Obama had signed, and I was a supporter of it. I thought it was a flawed deal, but I thought it was better than no deal. Donald Trump unilaterally walked away from it for reasons that are very difficult to fathom. There were many things wrong with the deal, but the way he walked away from it, I think, didn't benefit anyone. But but Europeans were still very much trying to revive the nuclear deal. The Biden administration comes in, and they too, in the beginning, were trying to revive the nuclear deal. By the time this movement happened, the Europeans first withdrew from the negotiations. They said, under these circumstances, we're not going to negotiate. The Biden administration also, less forcefully, but I think begrudgingly, reluctantly, but inevitably said we can't renegotiate deal under these circumstances. Now with Saudi Arabia and Iran moving towards a friendship, there are whispers that there are some in the Biden administration who want to revive the deal, who think the deal can be revived. The Israelis clearly don't think it should be or it can be. There is overwhelming evidence that Iranians are now very, very close to the breakout capacity that the nuclear deal was trying to delay. The premise of the Obama deal was that the breakout capacity will be delayed by 2 years. Now, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs recently said Iran can, within days, essentially, do it. When Israel virtually stole out of Iran and took to Israel the entire archive of Iran's nuclear program, the world realized that Iran was much more developed in developing a bomb than anybody had assumed. I'm sure Tom has talked to you about the U.S. changing its approach on how much Iran was going on the nuclear program in 2003. Tom was the chief author of one of the most important national intelligence estimates, arguably the national intelligence estimate that prohibited war between Iran and Iraq, between US and Iraq. If you remember, the reason that Bush administration went to war against Iraq was that Iraq had nuclear weapons. Once they went in there, it became clear that they did. But the belief was that Iran is actively trying to pursue a nuclear weapon. And there were some in the Bush administration, apparently Cheney was foremost amongst them, who said, we need to go and preemptively stop Iran from taking the next step in developing the bomb. But by 2007, when they are asked, they being the wisest heads in the US government and all the intelligence agencies, to report on how developed Iran's nuclear program was, they decide that Iran did have a military component to its nuclear program, but it stopped from 2003. It's a fascinating story of how they came to this conclusion. Tom was kind enough to come to my class every year and discuss this. I teach a course on US-Iran relations, and Tom gives a detailed account of this. And we've had many fascinating discussions about how reliable was the last intelligence that made them decide. But to his credit, Bush decides that they should declassify this report. Many people, including, I think, Tom, certainly the Israelis, were against the declassifying. Bush said, we have told the American people Iran had a nuclear program, a weapons program. Now you're telling me they don't, we should tell the American people. And they made it public. And at that time, I was amongst the many, many, many people who thought it was the liberals who leaked that. It was they who wanted to stop the Bush administration from going to war. It turns out it was Bush himself. The new data that has come out clearly seems to indicate that they were much more developed in terms of the military component than anybody thought. One of the people who has seen some of these documents, very few people have seen it, but one of the few people who has seen it, I've talked to him, so one of the most remarkable people, one of the top US scientists in the nuclear field, Sig Hacker. Sig Hacker and I have written 2 articles about Iran's nuclear program. And I suggested when the Biden administration was coming, maybe we should revise what we have written and offer a new alternative of how. He says, I don't want to write it anymore because the Iranians have lied to me so much. And almost everything I thought I knew, these people have lied about. So under that circumstance, a few days away, to now talk about the revival of the nuclear deal that will release billions of dollars into the hands of the regime that is not going to go to the Iranian people. The past practice has shown it's going to go to its own oppressive apparatus. It's going to go to Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hashd al-Sha'bi in Iraq, Hamas in, there were reports yesterday in Iranian media, I think Wall Street Journal covered it as well, that Mr. Qahani, who is the new commander of the Quds Brigade, replaced Qasem Soleimani, has been traveling covertly in the Middle East, meeting with these proxies, inviting them to increase their attacks on Israel. Iran and Israel are very close to a much larger confrontation. They have been at a virtual war for 2 years. Israel has been taking it to Iran in Syria. It's been attacking Iranian forces in Syria on a regular basis for almost 2 years. Iran occasionally responds, but hasn't responded as much as many people thought it would. So at this moment, trying to revive the nuclear deal, as some, again, in the Biden administration seem to be thinking is possible, to me seems like folly. Because not only it stabs the Iranian democratic movement in the back, it also helps that authoritarian new alliance that is emerging. Iran is the biggest supplier, at least known supplier, I should say, of weapons to Ukraine. China now seems to have sent some weapons under false names, but Iran has been openly sending drones. There have been reports about Iran's role in helping Russia mobilize Islamic fighters from Pakistan, Syria, Lebanon, Afghanistan to send to fight in Ukraine. That Russia can't do this on its own. Russia needs Iran, who has a very sophisticated network of ties to these kinds of forces. So to strengthen Iran at this moment is to strengthen that alliance that is said to be now the biggest challenge facing the West. I was just at a conference. I was supposed to come back today. Last night I came back late because I didn't want to miss a flight and miss. It was a conference where we had the speakers were General McMaster gave a talk. Admiral Ellis gave a talk. Sir Carter, who was a head of Defense Ministry in Britain, gave a talk. And they were all focused on one thing: the coming confrontation with China. Whether nobody yet talks about it as necessarily a military, but the Chinese are clearly preparing for that possibility, according to them, who are all experts. So if that is the coming confrontation, if that is the great decision, that is on the horizon. What happens in Iran doesn't stay in Iran. What happens in Iran has remarkable ramifications for all of these. And to me, the only solution to the problem of Iran, the only solution to Iran's nuclear problem, and the only way we can help Iran not become a source of shenanigans in the region is to help Iran become a democracy. I don't think there is any country in the region, any Muslim country in the region. Now I could say a country maybe in the region because of the challenges faced by Israeli democracy. That is as ready to create a democratic society as Iran. It's not going to be easy because the regime has at least 15 to 20% support, and it is brutal, and it is still very determined to keep in power. So the future few months and few years, I think, are full of peril and promise and making the right decision by Europeans and by United States in how they respond to this democratic movement, how and to what extent they support this democratic movement, I think is one of the most critical elements. I don't believe the Iranian democracy, let me end by this. I don't think Iranian democracy can be made by America, should be made by America. Iranian democracy can and should only be made by the people of Iran themselves. That's, to me, a moral imperative. It's also a very rational recognition that unless there is a will in a country, democracy being exported from the outside hasn't worked well. All you need to do is look at Iraq, look at Afghanistan, look at Libya, compare it with democratic promotion, successful democratic promotion in, of all places, Germany. There was a desire, ability, the infrastructure for democracy there. Japan, Korea, when there is no will and socioeconomic condition, democracy doesn't get realized. The good news is Iran has all of those things, and a lot of it I haven't mentioned. And the other thing that makes Iran this moment more ready than ever is that the Iranian diaspora is now more than ever mobilized to try to contribute to this transition. We just had a conference at Stanford 2 weeks ago, where we brought in 100 top academicians, experts, economists, lawyers, talking about what it takes for transition. This was a conference that 3 groups organized together. The Iranian Studies program at Stanford, a newfound group called CHI, Iranian American entrepreneurs, some of the most successful Iranian entrepreneurs of Silicon Valley, and a group called Gozar, a newly established group of some literally 80 top academicians, lawyers, technocrats, all united on one focus. Next Friday, you're more than welcome to send us an email. We'll sign you up to join a webinar. We have 6 of top Iranian entrepreneurs in the world. These are, one of them is Hamid Muqaddam, who has endowed my program, who's endowed my position, who's a member of the Stanford board. Shan Tejarati, second in charge of Honeywell. Afsaneh Beshla, CFO of World Bank till a few years ago. They are talking about transition to democracy in Iran, and from their perspective, the ailing Iranian economy and how we can fix it. They might not have the solutions, but the fact that all of these people 90% of them, uninterested in Iranian politics till a few months ago, are now dedicated to the idea of contributing, makes the moment more pivotal and makes the likelihood of making that right decision more likely to succeed. It's been a pleasure talking with you. I will now try to engage in a conversation with the rest. Thank you.
We have two questions from Zoom. May I go ahead and pose them?
Absolutely, please.
All right, so the first question is, if Iran were to become a democracy, what would the role of Islam be?
I think that's a very good question. I think there is now that the overwhelming.
We're going. You want to sign?
Pardon? No, I think.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yes. I think there's some polls that have been done recently from what I think is the most reliable of polls, because you have to remember it's hard to do polling in a despotic society. It's hard to do polling when you're doing the polling from outside. It is foolish to call people from Washington, as one of the polls does, and ask people, are you in favor of Mr. Khamenei? Not surprisingly, 78% said, yes, he's the best leader in the world. So the problem is trying to get to people's ideas. So a majority of Iranian people, a very large majority of Iranian people do not want Islam to be the ideological structure of power. They don't want the continuation of the status quo. Less than 50% of the Iranians, less than 50%. I'm going to say something that in this context might be a surprise. Iranian society today is far less religious than American society. More people believe in the necessity of separation of church and state in Iran than ever before. Now, that doesn't mean, one of the things that the religious folks continuously tell the people is that if you secularize society, you're going to lose your faith. One of the biggest lies that Khomeini and the religious radicals, Islamists, have been saying to the Muslims is that unless we make Islam the ideology of the state, we're going to lose Islam. But there is a whole strain of Islam, very different than this, that basically has said, and has said it for many centuries, that Islam should stay within the realm of people's lives and spiritual development. Islam cannot and should not become the ruling ideology. I personally believe that no religion can become the ideology of the state and not create a despotic society. If you have a Buddhist society, if you're going to rule by Buddhist rule, it's going to be not very different from the Islamic Republic of Iran. Democracy is based, Hannah Arendt famously said, on accepting ambiguity in the human condition. Religion promises certitude about spiritual matters. It doesn't accept that ambiguity. Shiism, according to Khomeini and Khamenei, are absolute in terms of what they think are the truth, and of having one truth, their truth, and everything else is falsehood. Out of that, you can't have democracy. But many people, including yours truly, believe that Islam will survive, but not as a state ideology, not as what Khomeini famously said, that our religion is our politics is our religion. Islam is, in my view, will go to where it should have a state in the mosque, in the privacy of home, to attend to people's spiritual needs, not become a form of apartheid. The clergy in Iran literally say, Khomeini's theory is literally based on this idea that the people are too stupid to rule themselves. He says people are like minors. Literally he says they're like minors. They need a shepherd. We are the shepherds. We, not me, we the clergy. And we are the shepherd because we understand Quran better than the rest of you. We know Sharia better than the rest of you. We know what the Prophet did 1400 years ago when somebody asked him a question. I say, even if you know that, that doesn't give you the right to rule today. Today's rule, today's reality requires today's collective wisdom. So Islam, I think, will survive in that way, but not as an state ideology. I think that day is soon going to be over.
Thank you. Another question here.
Let me follow up.
America's efforts to help
Luke?
other, yes,
Let me do a follow-on, because it does follow directly from the previous question. And that, sorry, is it gonna pick it up?
Stand in front of them.
it's good.
That the regime appears to have made or be making a choice that preservation of power trumps preservation of the religious or theocratic dimension of the revolution. It's autocratic as opposed to theocratic. And is that a tactical move that recognizes that the public has moved away from the religion? Or do they entertain the cognitive dissonance that they can adopt a Chinese model that's predicated on atheism and repression of religion and somehow square it, but staying in power is number one objective?
I think that's a great question, great two questions. I think the China model is very much that temptation, but not the China model of an atheist China. They think the China model works, but will work better if it becomes Islamic. Now, of course, they claim to be defenders of Islam and are silent about what the Chinese do to the Muslims in China. One of the most egregious breaches of human rights. China, incidentally, also Saudi Arabia, Qatar, United Arab Emirates, none of the Muslim countries have said a word about the treatment of the Muslims in China. But you know, Khomeini calls himself Amir al-Mu'minin, the leader of all the faithful. The Chinese faithful don't seem to be his domain of interest. But the other thing that they can't really claim the Chinese model is that the Chinese model, say what you will about it, it has worked economically for some people. It has transformed China from a third world poor country into a country that will soon, maybe in a couple of years, become the #1 economy in the world. They have moved people from the poor to the middle class. The Iranian regime has done the reverse. The Iranian regime has virtually impoverished at least half of the middle class. So they want that model, but they don't have the wherewithal to do it. I think if this regime was not as dogmatic as it is, it could easily have made some concessions in the last few years that would have allowed it to survive much longer. Right now, as some of the Islamist reformists said, they said, let's make some concessions on the veil. Let's release this tension. And this will help us get a better image. Khomeini doubled down and said, no, absolutely not. The veil is God's order, and we are here to enforce God's order. And if we give up on this, this is our Berlin Wall. literally. This is, some people say it's the Berlin Wall. Masih Ali-Nejad, this Iranian journalist, said for this regime, the veil is like the Berlin Wall. And Khamenei said, yes, she's right. This is we're not giving up. So they have decided to double down. I've talked about this in many other places, but let me briefly say what I think about Khamenei and Khomeini. That is, in a sense, over the last 100 years, within Shiism and within Islam in general, but I'm talking about Shiism because that's the dominant form of Islam in Iran. There have been two strains. One, a strain of Shiism that says modernity is coming, democracy is inevitable, rationalism and science are here, and we need to make concessions, and we need to understand this world. We need to become focused on the spiritual and forget about the political. We need to reform. In other words, there was a call for a reformation within Shiism. Khomeini and Khamenei are absolutely the counter-reformation. Khomeini and Khamenei keep doubling down on the idea that secularism, reform, giving up superstitious ideas, all of these are parts of a Jewish, Western, crusading conspiracy to undermine Islam. We should keep with the fundamentals. And to me, that might be their undoing.
Go ahead, Lou.
All right, thank you. So Marcia's question, America's efforts to quote unquote help other countries become more democratic have generally not been successful. Is there anything that we can do that helps more than hurts in the Iran situation? Is there anything we can do that helps more than hurts the democratic movement?
Where I think the efforts of America have failed is when America has tried unilaterally, for example, to change a society. The example is Iraq, for example. America's role in Iran, and I only want to talk about Iran because that's where I know a little about. The notion that America's role in Iran, the common left narrative about U.S. role in Iran has been that the U.S. was essentially a supporter of the Shah's authoritarianism. And one of the reasons the Shah fell is that the U.S. was consistently supporting his authoritarianism. Another very essential part of the same narrative is that the U.S. position in Iran began to deteriorate after 1953, when the CIA is known to have tried, and I'm choosing my words carefully, is known to have tried to overthrow the government of Mossadegh. Mossadegh was a very popular Iranian Democrat. He had nationalized Iran's oil, and as soon as he nationalized Iran's oil, Britain tried to attack Iran. The US stopped him. The Truman administration stopped Britain from attacking Iran. Said, no, this has to have a diplomatic problem. Britain tried to organize a coup against Mossadegh. Truman administration said, no, we can't. We have to see whether we can find a diplomatic solution. When they eventually decided that they can't convince Mossadegh to make concessions, they decided to sign up and try to overthrow Mossadegh. But once they tried, the effort seems to have failed. I've written about this in the Shah book at great length, and there is a whole new book of CIA, State Department, national intelligence estimates State Department Bureau of Intelligence, which was one of the most clever in understanding Iran. I once was talking to my friend here. I said, one of the best things I've read about Iran was what the State Department Bureau of Intelligence wrote about Iran at that time. He said, yeah, I was the head of that bureau at that time. So, if you actually look at what the US did in Iran from 1953 to 1979, the image is very different, much more complicated than the image you commonly get that the US was the sole supporter of Shah's authoritarianism. The US did support the Shah, but I have documented all of this in the Shah book. You can look at it. If you know your way around the internet, you can download it for free. I'm not trying to sell you a copy of the Shah book. But if you look at it, almost from 54 till 79, one of the common themes of US policy to the Shah is to tell the Shah, you need to democratize. At one time, the Shah needs the US money and listens more carefully. Once he becomes rich, after 65, 67, he no longer needs the US money. He says, thank you, but no thank you. When Nixon comes, Nixon tells the State Department, don't push the Shah on democracy. Leave him alone. He knows what he's doing. And give him all the weapons that he wants. So from the exception is from 68 to 74. Jimmy Carter comes and full frontal on human rights promotion in Iraq. So during the Cold War, there is, again, I don't want to generalize because I don't know enough about it, but I can say with some certainty that the US record in Iran was more complicated, more nuanced than the notion that they only supported authoritarianism. When they fail in their democracy promotion is, I think, when they become arrogant and they think, US thinks that they can change a country from outside. I think there has to be humility in foreign policy, even for the US at the height of its role. The US now has a much less dominance internationally than it did in 45 to maybe 2000. In a sense, I think, again, to go back, I think the notion that the US can't really decide everything in the world begins with the Nixon administration. It's Nixon that takes the dollar off the gold standard. It is Nixon that says you need to bring back some of the bases. It's Nixon that says we can't police the world and we need to create these local powers. So to me, I believe promotion of democracy is a moral value. I know Kissinger famously said that countries have interests, they don't have values, but I think countries do have interests and values. And if any country can have that, any country has proclaimed it in the past, it's the US. But promotion of democracy has to come, in my view, with the humility that you can't social engineer it. You have to work with what you have there, and you have to understand that you're not in a position that can change things at will. I don't know whether that answer was a long answer, but
let's take a question in the room.
Okay,
Go over here.
Arab Spring taught me that the likelihood of democracy in any Arab country was quite small. And I'm not sure we have any positive outcome from Arab Spring. What's the likelihood that if the current regime in Iran falls, that there's any likelihood that democracy will be the result, or just another autocrat?
Can you repeat the question? The question is, the Arab Spring was in general a failure, and the lesson that he took from the Arab Spring and the failure to develop any democracy is that it's very difficult to imagine any country, including Iran, becoming democratic. I think that's a very good question. But I think you have to take each of these countries historically and see what their trajectory was and whether they're comparable. Iran is only comparable to Turkey and to Egypt in terms of its history of civil society, of its history of trying to have a democratic. And in some ways, it was even ahead of Egypt. Iran, if you look at the constitutional, Iran had its first effort at a constitutional revolution, a democratic constitution in 1905 or 7. Saudi Arabia wasn't even a country then. Qatar and United Arab Emirates and Lebanon and Egypt, all of these, Iraq, were part of the Ottoman Empire. They didn't exist. Iran existed. And Iran had a movement. Iran had a woman in 1844 who took the veil off. Iran had the most powerful leftist movement of any country in the Muslim world. Now, that was because of Soviet influence, but Soviet influence was in Iraq, in all of these. Why is it that you have the most sophisticated Marxist, Stalinist movement? There are cultural reasons for that as well, but Iran developed very powerful. Iran, before anybody else in the region, developed a nationalist movement that nationalized the oil. So there is no movement in any Muslim country that I know of that is comparable to the Iranian women's movement. So there are many things that have created in a long historical process over 150 years, essentially, that makes Iran the likely candidate. But in the conference we just had, I told you about, one of the panels was a three-way conversation between, some of the panels are in Persian, this one was in English. So I'll be glad to share it with you. I can share it with Tom, he can share it with anybody. It's a conversation between Larry Diamond, who's the world's top experts on democracy, Mike McFaul, an equally renowned scholar of democracy, and myself. The three of us have been working on a project called the Iran Democracy Project at Hoover for 22 years. So although they're not, the two of them are not experts on Iran, they're world experts on democracy. And the question is exactly, is it likely that there will be a transition to democracy in Iran? And they all agree that Iran has the requisite conditions: a middle class, an active women's movement, literacy, rise of urbanism, inquisitiveness about the world. 90% of Iranians, 90% today, use VPNs. Iran has one of the most draconian efforts to control the social media, and Iran has one of the most active social media scenes. There is a battle going on. And there are other indicators, you know, the rise of urbanism, all of these things. Iran has the socioeconomic requisites, But those are not enough for a transition to democracy. For transition to democracy to occur, you need a breakdown of the regime. You need cracks within the regime. You need a dissolution of the apparatus of oppression. So there is no guarantee that if the movement comes, there's no guarantee. But in social science, we look at trend lines. We look at what countries like with similar socioeconomic histories and statuses have done, and make cautious, humble predictions about the trend. It's very likely that before we get to that stage, the IRGC, Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, which is the dominant military and is now the dominant economic force in the country, it will take over and try to do a Pakistan model. Some people predict, the regime does, that the regime says, if we go, Iran becomes Assyria, that there is civil war on the horizon. My guess is, and we have another discussion, I'll be glad to share that with you as well. I have a discussion with Mullah Hisham bin Abdullah, who's a Moroccan prince. He has endowed a program on development, the democratic developments in the Arab world. And he's written a book on what is called pacted transition to democracy. In political science, there's a term called the pacted transition. That's when the regime is incapable of ruling and the opposition is incapable of overthrowing them. And the moderates on both sides eventually wise up and say, okay, we make some concessions, you make some concessions, let's save the country. More or less what happened successfully in South Africa. More or less what happened in Poland. More or less what happened unsuccessfully in Egypt. More or less what happened almost successfully in Tunisia. Tunisia just went sour. Tunisia was the one hope we had for the Arab Spring. So that possibility, I think, exists for Iran. It won't be a transition immediately to a democratic Iran. It will be a transition to a more democratic, less authoritarian, less corrupt regime that is gingerly moving in the direction of that democracy. To me, that's the most desirable path. And I think it's not the most unlikely path. I have a lot of indications that there are many people within the regime who think that the regime in its current iteration is no longer tenable. There are beginning signs of cracks within the regime. The IRGC hasn't cracked at all. The regime's oppressive apparatus hasn't cracked at all, as far as I know. But the regime has shown signs of cracks. Mousavi, who's in prison, who was a prime minister for 8 years during the war, who probably won the election in 2009, at least I think, many people think, has been in prison for 11 years now with his wife. He issued a statement a few weeks ago, said the regime is finished. The only way to avoid disaster is to have a referendum. There are other signs of cracks. I don't want to give a long answer. Maybe we can ask another question.
Robert. I appreciate respect your authority on this, but I just wanted to say that I was looking through the picture of my brother, trying to figure out what is democracy, and we looked up the roots. So the demo means a popular form of government, and crack means to participate. So participating in something more popular reminded my brother and I of 20 o'clock in high school to try to be popular. Like one of the people that, gets the girls and stuff. I just think that there's a shadow behind this weaponry development of atomic bombs, and I don't know if that shadow can stay in the shadows when you get the same hate from Israel that you might have for your own regime leadership. So I just feel like popularity is what we all want to go to heaven. We want to be one of the people that believe in others. And I just hope everybody finds a way to follow that.
Well, the idea that democracy is a good form of government that we should strive for is a fairly new idea. If you look at, if you read Plato, for example, and Aristotle, the two foundational texts for political theory, both of them say democracy is the worst form of government. Because the demos, basically they say, aren't interested in anything other than the next beer and the next pleasures of life. And the only thing they want to do is get the money from the rich, divide it up, and destroy the system. And whoever is charlatan enough to promise them more beer, they will go after. That's what Plato says. The solution is the rule of the philosopher king, which is almost exactly what Khomeini and Khomeini said. Khomeini and Khomeini's theory is really the Republic of Plato, with a little minor tweak. Plato says philosophers should do it. Khomeini says philosophers are stupid. I am the wise one, and I know better than philosophy. I know God's philosophy. It's the same idea. In modern times, we believe that people don't just want to divide the wealth or have more beer. We believe people have loftier ideas. That's the basic of democracy. When I talk about Iranian politics, one of the things I always ask students to read, and if you haven't read it, some of you I'm sure have read it, I strongly urge you to read it, is Dostoevsky's Grand Inquisitor. In the novel, Brothers Karamazov, because we're in the church, it has even more relevance. In the novel Brothers Karamazov, there is a text about 18 pages long. If you Google it, you can read it online. And it's been published and republished and reissued. It's literally 18 pages. Christ has been born again in Seville at the height of the Inquisition. And people have gathered around him. And the Grand Inquisitor sees it and orders his forces to arrest Christ. They arrest Christ, bring him to prison, and Grand Inquisitor at night comes to him and says, you misunderstand humans. You think humans want freedom. You think humans want to make choices. We, the church, the inquisitors, not the church, the inquisitors, we believe humans don't want choice. People prefer security, mystery, authority. We tell them, we give you what you need. They're more than happy to give us the freedom. Every totalitarian system in the last 100 years is based on that same idea. Eric Fromm wrote a book, Escape from Freedom. It says people don't want freedom. In my own classes, every year, every quarter at Stanford, I have students ask me, how many pages does the paper have to be? I say, you choose. They're very uncomfortable. They said, give us a range. If you have them choose, the burden is on them. I believe that people have the capacity, the desire, the dignity, the decency to make the right choice. They want to make the right choice. Authoritarianism and totalitarianism believes they don't. And I gave a talk yesterday at this conference that I was talking about. I told everybody, and there were some very interesting people sitting in the audience, including Condi Rice and Jim Mattis. I said, you should all read The Grand Inquisitor, because that is what the moment is about. The Grand Inquisitor at this moment is the Chinese Communist Party and Putin. And the little guy running after them is Khamenei, saying the same thing. People don't want to make choices. People are happy if we give them a bigger house, give them a better car, giving them more money, and take their freedom away. In a way, that's what the Shah tried to do. The Iranian economy was booming in 75. Now, it had a little problem, but the Shah's basic premise was that I'll give you anything you want, economically, culturally, even politically. Just don't attack me. Iran culturally in 1975 was one of the freest countries anywhere in the world, not just the Muslim Middle East. Iran had a gay marriage in 1975, openly. The Shah's sister, Shams, converted to Catholicism. Today, there are hundreds of people in Iran in prison for converting out of Islam to Christianity. The Baha'is, the Jews, the Zoroastrians had the highest relative freedom. But politically, the Shah says, don't go there. I'll give you all of these, and I'll give you more economic prosperity. But does man live by bread alone? Read the Bible. And I think the time is up.
I think the time is up, unfortunately. You've done a terrific job. The questions, again, have been very, very good in helping to enlighten further the issue. I thank you, Abbas, for giving us of your wisdom and your insight. I thank everybody who has participated in the Great Decisions program in person or in Zoom land. I remind everyone that the recordings will be posted on the Great Decisions website, on the church webpage. So in a day or two, you'll be able to see this one. You can review any of them. I think we've had a very, very good series. I thank everybody who contributed. And I would be very remiss not to single out Scott Thomas, Bill Nichols, Lou Bellardo, and Charlotte Kutkowski for all of the help in putting this together. See you all next year. Thank you much.
Thank you, everyone. Want to stop the recording now and stop the session. Good night.